My return guest today is Angela Nagle, who inaugurated this podcast just a bit over a year ago, and is back to discuss a text we both first read a while ago and then have reread recently, which is George Orwell's The Road to Wigan Pier. So thanks for being willing to come on again, Angela, and talk to me about this
Oh,
text.
thanks for having me.
Yeah, so this is Orwell's, it's his second nonfiction book, and I think his fourth book altogether. So it kind of comes in the middle of his productive career. It's published in 1937, and it, just to give a broad overview, it's essentially a kind of report on the conditions of a region of the north of England, that is at the time heavily industrialized, central area for coal mining, and is also, this is still the Great Depression, so is also just kind of a place where various kinds of social crises are concentrated at the time. So he is commissioned by the Left Book Club to go and write this report. In some ways, it's a continuation, and he sort of makes this explicit of his previous nonfiction book, Down and Out in Paris and London. And it's in a sense a kind of book about slumming, and it's very much about his own class status as what he calls a member of the lower upper middle class, and his experience as a sort of both outside observer and somebody who's engaged in this kind of ethnographic immersion in these poor and working class areas and communities. So that's just kind of a general, introduction to this text for those who are unfamiliar. Just to start, how was your experience of reading this, and perhaps how did it compare to your earlier experience of it?
Yeah, I was trying to remember what age I might have been when I first read it, and I dread to think. I think it was actually a very long time ago. Uh, and it clearly had an impact on me because when I was reading it again, I thought, oh, I kind of sound like this sometimes, like it must have imprinted itself on me in some way, particularly the second part, where he's sort of doing more analysis. And it's a theme also in kind of different essays he's written and stuff like that. Like I remember one which was sort of about why it is that the right is able to write these exciting heroic boys books, and he was sort of comically like imagining what a leftist one would look like, and how terrible it would be, and because it would just be a tract, and yeah, so that kind of like that endless question that sort of plagued me for so long, which is like, why is it that, or what do you do when like the idea of socialism is one thing, but then the socialists are another, right? And you can't allow socialists to have power because that would be terrible, but you can't actually, but you don't necessarily, your view of the idea of socialism itself hasn't changed, and so that's kind of like the great stuff that he gets into in the second part. But then even in the observation, that was really excellent as well. And it used to really bug Christopher Hitchens that every time somebody wanted to attack Orwell on the left, they would say, oh, he said that the working class were smelly because of this book. But he's just describing really honestly, like he's not trying to romanticize anyone or put anyone down. He's just very honestly describing what he sees. And he's also honest about his own class position, which is that he's kind of aware in this really tumultuous time in British history, in European history, he knows that like the place that he and people like him are in, they're very much in danger of falling downward. And at one point, I think he says something like, I could, if the worst should happen, like I could survive a lot of, hard labor jobs. But the one thing that would kill me is a coal miner's job. So he's just being totally honest, which is very refreshing in and of itself, right? Because leftists are almost always lying in some way, right? They're almost always using a moral category to kind of rationalize a selfish desire, which we all have. But instead of being honest about them, they have to kind of use these these moral categories and stuff to conceal like what they really feel, whereas he's just describing things exactly as he sees them. He's trying to make completely real and authentic observations. Like I love the bit where he says that the worst landlord, the most tyrannical landlord, is actually a poor landlord. And in the same way, like an undercapitalized small business can be way worse to work for than a big world-spanning corporation.
Yeah. So just for a bit further background, the first half of this, again, is sort of his sort of reporting on the conditions of what he sees in these areas. So we could think of this part of the book as kind of in the tradition of Engels', condition of the working class in England, and perhaps a later addition to this is E.P. Thompson's The Making of the English Working Class. And he's really, in the first part, he's not really theorizing. He's really just kind of observing and reporting. But he does have these kind of, he is clearly avoiding any kind of romanticization of this situation as far as possible, right? He's trying to, and I think he, particularly in the second part, he talks about, and I think this has an explicit purpose, which is that, he talks about basically the way that sort of standard middle-class socialists, and, he makes clear that he is a middle-class socialist, but, that their entire way of talking about the people whose interests they claim to be fighting for is this kind of mystified, romanticized fantasy, right?
Yeah.
And so he's clearly just trying to, fight against that tendency as much as possible. And, he basically in the first part is just sort of, going around observing what he sees and also commenting on his own, and I guess the other point about he says, this whole comment about this sort of smell is, also couched within the whole question of how, of the class system in England, and how, basically part of what he's arguing is that, those who would fault him for saying that are themselves just, completely lying to themselves and us.
Yeah.
And, he has some great lines about, what if you sort of had, what most of these people who claim to be Bolsheviks or whatever, that they wouldn't, that this lifestyle would be completely, impossible for them to adopt. Right. So anyway, the first part is largely this kind of observation. The second part is where he, addresses this question, which you brought up, of why is socialism not gaining traction among the people who, it claims to be on behalf of, and essentially among the people who he's been sort of observing and describing in the first part. So, I think another thing that's striking about the first part is just it has this really, it has this quality of a kind of astonishment at, the sort of horrifying, the kind of horrifying and abject kind of refuse that the sort of churn of capitalist production is creating, right? That he's kind of interested in it as this vast machine that's just kind of churning out all of this hideous and horrifying, just I mean, essentially kind of human refuse, which are who are just left to kind of fend for themselves in the best way possible. And so there's I think an interesting, he part of what he's objecting to is which I think is the sort of sheer irrationality or apparent irrationality of the system, right? So it's more a kind of he doesn't engage in any kind of sentimental or sort of pitying sort of observation of the people who are sort of caught up in this disaster, but instead it seems to me what he's kind of expressing is just this kind of sheer astonishment at the kind of horrifying monstrosity that the system is generating on a daily basis. I don't know if that was sort of how you, and so, in a sense that this relates to how he kind of frames the appeal of socialism almost more as a kind of intellectually appealing system, because it promises to do away with the sheer kind of irrational cruelty and sadism of the system that he's observing. I don't know if that was sort of how you read it, but
yeah, I think so. I mean, the thing is, a lot of that, what he's describing, is really the product of industrial society, and whether countries industrialized officially under the name of capitalism or Marxism, I mean, they both had these kinds of conditions, in fact, because there is a stage of development that kind of necessitates it to some degree. Just getting coal out of the ground, whether like capitalists or Bolsheviks are in charge, the coal has to come up. So there's always been that kind of more romantic streak in English socialism, I think. Think of like the Diggers or, all that kind of stuff, which is something different from the Marxist tradition, So I think that's always there when you read English socialists. Like, there is a kind of horror at industrial society that to me is something separate. It maybe has more of a romantic root than a Marxian one,
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, I think even, I mentioned E.P. Thompson before, but I think there's something of that in his sort of account as well. I mean, here's a passage that I think is one, it kind of expresses what I was trying to articulate about it. So he says, it is no use that saying that people like the Brookers, so the Brookers are the sort of landlords of this lodging house that he lives in, are just disgusting and trying to put them out of mind, for they exist in the tens and hundreds of thousands. They are one of the characteristic byproducts of the modern world. You cannot disregard them if you accept the civilization that produced them, for this is part at least of what industrialism has done for us. Columbus sailed the Atlantic, the first steam engines tottered into motion, the British squares stood firm under the French guns at Waterloo, the one-eyed scoundrels of the 19th century praised God and filled their pockets, and this is where it all led, to labyrinthine slums and dark back kitchens with sickly, aging people creeping around and round them like black beetles. It is a kind of duty to see and smell such places now and again, especially smell them, lest you should forget that they exist, though perhaps it is better not to stay too long. So I think that's, it's a good passage for just kind of capturing how he understands what he's doing.
Yeah, no, I guess it's also that question that people always have of like, about modern society, like, is this worth it, Because on the one hand, we know that, industrialization, like us out of the Malthusian trap, and it kind of enabled all this great wealth, like in time, but it has all these costs along the way. And ultimately, it may just have a natural endpoint, which will have a cost as well. When you look at even today, like in England, if you look at a place that has been deindustrialized, you can't help but have the thought of like, was this worth it? Maybe this was a mistake. Like, I understand that romantic way of thinking, and yeah, so that's definitely in there too, I think.
And he has another interesting section related to this his kind of revulsion at the sheer irrationality is one that, really, it's interesting to see a point like this made as early as this, which again is 1937. So he says 20 million people are underfed, but literally everyone in England has access to a radio. What we have lost in food, we have gained in electricity. Whole sections of the working class who have been plundered of all they really need are being compensated in part by cheap luxuries which mitigate the surface of life. Do you consider all this desirable? No, I don't. But it may be that the psychological adjustment which the working classes are visibly making is the best they could make in the circumstances. They have neither turned revolutionary nor lost their self-respect. Merely they have kept their tempers and settled down to make the best of things on a fish and chip standard. The alternative would be God knows what continued agonies of despair, or it might be attempted insurrections which, in a strongly governed country like England, could only lead to futile massacres and a regime of savage repression. So, and then, of course, the post-war development of cheap luxuries has been a very fortunate thing for our rulers. It is quite likely the fish and chips, art silk stockings, tint salmon, cut-price chocolate, the movies, the radio, strong tea, and the football pools have between them averted revolution. Therefore, we are sometimes told that the whole thing is an astute maneuver by the governing class, a sort of bread and circuses business to hold the unemployed down. What I've seen of our governing class does not convince me that they have that much intelligence. The whole thing has happened, but by an unconscious process. The quite natural interaction between the manufacturer's need for a market and the need of half-starved people for cheap palliatives.
Yeah, that's great. I mean, that still holds.
Yeah, and it's so, it's just stunning to see those kind of observations, which I feel like I've been sort of hearing versions of that from people on the left my whole life, pretty much. And, you can think about how, on one hand, I remember this being like a standard sort of conservative argument a while ago that, it's like, well, how can there be poverty in America if everybody has a flat screen TV or everyone has a cell phone or things like that?
Yeah.
So obviously on one hand, that's unsatisfying in its way. But, then there's kind of on one hand this, and I think there you have him, again, trying to contend with the failure of a kind of revolutionary consciousness to take hold. In a way that also kind of anticipates maybe things like the Frankfurt School and much more familiar ideas that became much more familiar in the post-war period, and that a great deal of thought went into, and it seems like he just kind of offhandedly develops a pretty similar analysis just in those couple of paragraphs.
Yeah. And, it also makes me think, if you think about, why this whole question that he's considering of like the kind of person. Okay, so you have this problem, right? There is this irrationality in the system. We can't provide the basics, but the system can provide the radios and things like that. Today, it might, it would be like cheap consumer goods are everywhere, but we still to this day cannot master the basics of life, like make sure that everyone has the basics of life. But then here's the problem, right? An intelligent sort of mind that is a planning mind, thinks, well, I could fix this. If we rationally planned this, then it would be fixable. But then he kind of goes on to talk about the problem of the fact that the rational planning mind that is attracted to that prospect is destructive and tyrannical 9 times out of 10 by its nature. So then you're stuck in this problem. And he talks about how the socialist rational planning mind sort of sees the world as a chessboard, and they're frustrated at the untidiness of reality. They think it can't be right that all of these radios exist, but food and housing, is in short supply. And so he can see the problem with empowering the planning mind to order the world like a chessboard in the way that it wants, but then can also see why this irrationality is a problem. And so that just leaves you with a dilemma. What do you do with that problem?
Yeah, and I think, this is where, as I was saying before, it's like he really frames this in terms of his kind of horrified astonishment at the sheer irrationality of the system. But then, as you say, he has this kind of critique of the way that, again, the planning mind is drawn to socialism and related doctrines because it gravitates towards this this need to kind of tidy things up and to, essentially make the world match some kind of intellectual blueprint.
Yeah.
And so, I mean, I think that's a deep sort of tension in the book, because he doesn't, in a sense, he doesn't renounce this kind of impulse in himself entirely, but he also has a very strong critique of it.
Yeah, because the thing is, it's not enough to say, okay, well, just live with the irrationality, like just accept it, because it actually is wrong. And so, but the two things can be true at once. That's the system is wrong, but the people who are gathering to fix it are, have this problem within them as well, have this kind of pitiless way of wanting to move people around so that the world will conform to the image in their minds of a rationally ordered world. Yeah, there's a bit, I just have a quote here. Let me see. Oh yeah, so there's a bit, I mean, this is kind of like the best example of the thing that we're talking about. So he kind of has to start off, this is a funny thing, right? The way, well, I don't do this anymore, but for many years I sort of wasted time. I still see some people doing this where they have to say, now, I'm not saying, like, they have to say, like, this is why I'm doing this critique for socialism, guys, right? I'm trying to make it better. I'm trying to make the socialist movement better, and he has to spell that out in the vain hope that they won't all get mad at him for saying these things, but of course they do anyway. So he starts with that, and he explains that he's going to be devil's advocate. And he says, anything is relevant which helps to make clear why socialism is not accepted. And he says, and please notice that I'm arguing for socialism, not against it. But for the moment, I am devil's advocate. So he says, I'm making out a case for what sort of person who is in sympathy with the fundamental aims of socialism, but who has the brains to see that socialism would, quote unquote, work, but who in practice always takes to flight when socialism is mentioned. Question a person of this type, and you will often get the semi-frivolous answer, I don't object to socialism, but I do object to socialists. Logically, it is a poor argument, but it carries weight with many people. As with the Christian religion, the worst advertisement for socialism is its adherents. So, to me, that's a great way of approaching this, because he's not like I think a lot of the time. So if you become disgusted by the socialists, then it's very reasonable to react to that by rejecting socialism. But he's sort of saying, actually, you're still left with this problem, which is that the problems in society that would lead one to a socialist analysis still exist. So it isn't enough to just sort of say, oh, well, then you just become apolitical or something like that, or you just reject the whole thing. You're still left with the reality of saying, of having to answer, what are you for? What is the problem, and what are you advocating? So what do you do if the answer to that question is the same as it used to be? If you still say, I still see the same problems, and I still think the answer is something that you might describe as socialism broadly conceived, but I'm stuck because I can see the problems with that actually most people can see. I think so his position is basically, I think, the most common one, right? Nobody wants lower wages, right? And nobody wants to not be able to afford housing and healthcare and things like that. But giving power to these people is also a nightmarish prospect. And he just lets you sort of sit with that contradiction. Instead of trying to resolve it, he just leaves us with that problem that's an unsolvable problem.
Yeah, and it's interesting in light of all this that he, there was a sort of checkered publication history, because essentially he wrote the first part, which was essentially this kind of brutal sort of observational report on the conditions of people in and around this town in the north of England, and that part was sort of considered, his publisher, which again was the Left Book Club, thought that was okay. But when he gets into this kind of ruthless criticism of the socialism and socialists as they exist, he really and he as you said, he frames it explicitly as sort of devil's advocate type position, the goal of which is to kind of improve the prospects of the movement. But nevertheless, his publisher did not like that section, and basically initially asked him, as I recall, to remove it and wanted to just publish the first part. And then he refused on that. So basically the publisher added a sort of critical foreword in which he, sort of scolded Orwell for his, for his unfortunate, ideological deviations and so on. So, this is perhaps an experience you might relate to.
Yeah, it's so funny how nothing changes. Like, and you can actually see, in the, like, I read some kind of extracts from reviews, like positive and negative responses to it, and you can just see, like, one of them said something like, he didn't even define socialism, that kind of thing, that like retreat into pedantry that they do when you're actually trying to grapple with something that's really important, and they won't answer they won't even allow the question, the profound question, to be discussed. And so they sort of loftily like dismiss the whole thing because, you didn't define socialism. Like, that's just such an enraging response, but it's exactly what they do now still, And yeah, the other kind of thing of like, the first bit shows that he's one of us and he's a good person, but the second bit, it's not acceptable.
Yeah, it's really remarkable. And I mean, this, so I guess, when I was rereading this, I did think of some things you've written, and you did say earlier on in our discussion that you felt like maybe you had been somewhat influenced by this text in ways you maybe hadn't noticed. But anyway, I appreciate this. I don't know if this passage maybe reminded me a little bit of certain things you've written, but so the first thing that must strike any outside observer is that socialism is in its developed form is a theory confined entirely to the middle class. The typical socialist is not, as tremulous old ladies imagine, a ferocious looking working man with greasy overalls and a raucous voice. He is either a youthful snob Bolshevik who in 5 years' time will quite probably have made a wealthy marriage and been converted to Roman Catholicism. Or still more typically, and by the way, I mean, another thing just in terms of like weird online stuff, he keeps bringing up this that basically either you become a socialist or a Bolshevik and then later you convert to Catholicism, or if you're of this class, you either become a socialist or you convert to Catholicism. So sounds rather
familiar. Yeah.
But anyway, or still more typically, a prim little man with a white-collar job, usually a secret teetotaler, and often with vegetarian leanings, with a history of nonconformity behind him, and above all with a social position which he has no intention of forfeiting. This last type is surprisingly common in socialist circles of every shade. It has perhaps been taken over en bloc from the old Liberal Party. In addition to this, there is the horrible, really disquieting prevalence of cranks wherever socialists are gathered together. One sometimes gets the impression that the mere words socialism and communism draw towards them with magnetic force every fruit juice drinker, nudist, sandal wearer, sex maniac, Quaker, nature cure, quack, pacifist, and feminist in England. One day this summer, I was riding through Letchworth when the bus stopped and two dreadful-looking old men got onto it. They were both about 60, both very short, pink, and chubby, and both hatless. One of them was obscenely bald. The other had long gray hair, bobbed in the Lloyd George style. They were dressed in pistachio-colored shirts and khaki shorts, into which their huge bottoms were crammed so tightly you could study every dimple. Their appearance created a mild stir of horror on top of the bus. The man next to me, a commercial traveler, I should say, glanced at them and then back at me and murmured, "Socialists," as he should say, "Red Indians." He was probably right. The ILP were holding their summer school at Letchworth. The point is, to him, as an ordinary man, a crank meant a socialist and a socialist meant a crank. Any socialist, he probably felt, could be counted on to have something eccentric about him. And some such notion exists even among socialists themselves. For instance, I have a prospectus from another summer school, which states its terms per week and asks me to say whether my diet is ordinary or vegetarian. They take it for granted, you see, that it is necessary to ask this question. This kind of thing is by itself alienate plenty of decent people. And their instinct is perfectly sound. For the food crank is by definition a person willing to cut himself off from human society in hopes of adding 5 years onto the life of his carcass. That is a person out of touch with common humanity.
Yeah.
So,
yeah, no, it's absolutely hilarious. I mean, the analysis is just so funny.
I guess, in some ways, I suppose one thing we might say about this is that, there's often this idea that certain critiques, you and others have made of the left in recent years are specific to this maybe kind of post-Cold War, left in the absence of any kind of worker, labor mobilization or, rootedness in unions or things like that. But this would all suggest that the history goes back quite a bit further.
Yeah, I had that thought too, because we're always trying to say, okay, where did it all go wrong, right? And the first thought is some people go, oh, it was Occupy Wall Street. But then, okay, that's clearly not convincing. So the obvious point is 68. But no, the more you look back into it, the more you see these are archetypes almost. And that kind of priestly personality is what you're actually dealing with. That's why they go seamlessly from socialism to Catholicism. And they're like this disembodied brain that is full of like rage. And they're totally disturbed by the untidiness of the world and the irrationality of the world. And they also have a kind of vengeful rage against someone. They want to use their mastery of moral concepts to kind of dominate others. They can't physically dominate the world, so because they're not like the warrior type or whatever. So they have to take the longer view and dominate the world through ideas, which is actually a very successful method of domination because we are all trapped in the concepts that people like this created. Totally trapped. Even if you look at this silly Joe Rogan thing, right? That's kind of an example, right? In the world of MMA or something like that, Joe Rogan is a person who has status and who sort of belongs and who like makes sense and thrives in that world. But when you kind of step into this arena that is in which the disembodied brain, priestly concept creators have supreme power, they can just get rid of you, no problem. Even if they are totally uncharismatic, disgusting to most people, they will sit in their corner and dominate the world through their concepts, for 1,000 years maybe. And so this is a type, this is like a Nietzschean kind of theme as well. Like this is a type of person who will always be with us. And the reason that just as they can seamlessly go from Trotskyism to the Catholic Church, it's because they're the same type of person. That's why I think that idea of the Brahmin or the priest or the commissar as this universal type, I think is a very good way of seeing things, because you start to see, I guess, like this very powerful motivation within them that will always be with us. And you can only manage them to some degree. And also that it's not just about socialism, because those types of people would find something else if they were in different historical circumstances. And that's why they can fixate into food quack stuff or religion, all these other things. But that still leaves you then with the political problem of what to do about this.
This also, since you brought up the Rogan thing, another point I think is relevant here is the tech industry. You've sort of written about the political effects of the sort of rise of big tech, but basically what you have early on is this, so a couple things that are interesting here. Another sort of transition that occurred was you had the sort of post-68 Californian, sort of counterculture migrate into the tech industry. And so it's a complicated picture because on one hand, you had this kind of libertarian spirit, which has largely been kind of drummed out at this point. But you did also have all of these kind of subcultural values and ideas kind of migrate into that sphere. So, as this book called From Counterculture to Cyberculture discusses. And so what's interesting now is that you have basically this vast, the tech industry has this kind of vast sort of middle management class within it, which is, and so I think this, there's some sort of genealogy here, but But I think, this class is sort of to be distinguished from the kind of freewheeling sort of founder class of the earlier phase of the tech industry, because they're basically, managers and bureaucrats, right? And so when you have a huge amount of sort of cultural and political life having transferred onto these platforms, one thing that happens is you have these people of this kind of priestly mentality that you've been describing have a huge role within this industry, right? And so that's where you get basically the impulse to sort of deplatform and sort of crack down on all of these platforms often comes from within these companies, because they have this sort of sub-managerial class within them, right, that demands all of these things. And that's also been the case with media, right? That often, if you look at what's happened at various legacy media outlets, it's like the people who are sort of revolting against the sort of older values of journalism are often the people who work in the sort of on the tech side of things. So I think one thing we've seen is basically that the rise of the tech industry and the sort of transfer of so much onto these platforms has sort of led to a migration of exactly this sort of person into these sorts of roles, which gives them a kind of leverage within the sort of information economy, right? To enforce to enforce their vision. I mean, to enforce their kind of purity codes and so on. So I don't know if that.
No, that's interesting. I mean, I guess it's just, again, it's the type, right? I think I remember Tucker Carlson saying that, like, most people there are people in, I think he said, like, in apartments in Brooklyn who lose sleep over the idea that somebody somewhere in the country is having a wrong thought, whereas like the vast majority of people would just never conceive of such a thing. But the problem is that the people who do have that drive within them are in power terms worth 1,000 people in one, because they will call up the person's boss and they will do more activism and political pressure in one lifetime than 1,000 or many thousand regular people will do, which is almost none. And the thought of those people having this kind of supreme power is absolutely terrifying. And it's not just like, I don't just mean that in the sense of like, oh, big government or like giving the state too much power or something like that. It's more, I guess, the dark, vengeful side of it, that is so troubling. And those people are just as happy being in the bureaucracy of a private company as they would be in a socialist government or something like that. And like, how do you stop those people from getting into those positions? Because they are naturally drawn to those priestly roles. And in many cases, I mean, one thing I've started thinking a lot recently is like on this whole question, because if you see the behavior and the character and the bad character of socialists, and then you extrapolate from that socialism is wrong, or that it's just pointless to talk about it at all in the abstract, because in reality, the actually existing socialists are like this. And so you're going to be putting them in power, and there's no way around that. And so you take from that the theory is wrong or that it's irrelevant. Well, the problem with that is that an abstract idea can be anything. Like in the hands of Chinese Communist Party, socialism is like a civilizational state. In the hands of the Western left, socialism is the exact opposite of that. It's like an anti-civilization movement. It sees civilizational restrictions on the individual will and practice. So really you could say basically there's something else at work, that abstract ideologies basically are irrelevant. Like and religion too. It's the people who bend the ideas to their will and to their spirit. And so if the Chinese had a different system or it had a different name, it would probably take on the same form, because it's an expression of people and a leadership who have a kind of who have that civilizational drive. And I think that maybe our problem is that, because I think that if you're a sort of brainy type of person, you see this thing that we've witnessed, right? The disaster of how horrible socialists are and everything, right? And so then you think, well, okay, now I have to reject the idea and the ideal because of the fact that you simply cannot get around this problem of these terrible people. But I increasingly think that basically it's wrong to then go retreat into abstractions and say, okay, well, maybe if I could just come up with the ideal theory, then it would fix this problem. Like, what if you said, okay, we're going to have a movement that's like a conservative socialism, right? Like that has, a history in Britain as well. That would fix the radical liberals, right? They would go away and you would get them out of your movement, and then you just get the theory right and it will work. But I actually think this just isn't true, and it's just ultimately a waste of time, because it's the spirit of the people that is wrong. And no matter what they do, it doesn't matter what religion they take on, what ideology they take on, the same problem will appear. Because if it was the theory, then why is it that it's an anti-civilizational force in the West and it's a pro-civilizational force in China? So that's kind of what I'm thinking about now. That's the main thing I'm sort of preoccupied with. And I don't know how people, how they manifest that kind of like thumos or whatever you want to call it. But, we know the Renaissance happened, right? Like people can manifest these things. It's still mysterious to me how, but I just think that if that's wrong, if you are kind of spiritually disordered, then everything you do will be wrong. You can call it socialism, you can call it liberalism, you can call it nationalism, whatever. It will all take on this disordered form because there is something fundamental there that abstract ideology does not cover.
Yeah, and I think, it goes back to the idea that the person who criticized Orwell for not defining socialism, I think in some ways throughout this book, he is extremely suspicious of theory, basically, and of any kind of, he's really, explicitly kind of rejecting sort of Marxist language. In some sense, his concern seems to be similar. And also, again, he's attuned to the ways that these types of people who are drawn to this kind of movement, may then drift away from it and become Catholics or whatever. So, fundamentally, he's more interested in looking at the problem. And, I think he's on one hand, as I said, his interest in the problem is one of a kind of, astonished horror at the sheer irrationality of this system and the sort of horrifying byproducts that it creates and sort of what it subjects human beings to and turns them into. But at the same time, he's also suspicious of solutions that take the form of a kind of, creating an intellectual blueprint that if only it could be imposed on the world, then it could make all of this go away. Another section of it that's really interesting. So he's trying to understand why people are not drawn to socialism, right? One reason is because of the socialists, right? Who he describes, in the terms I just read out. But then the other big point that he makes is that, and I think this is something that, for the disappearance of this kind of way of thinking, which is this kind of high-tech futurism, right? Which he associates with H.G. Wells, in his period as kind of the most, the best known kind of expositor of this version of socialism, which is about, advancing technology to the point that it creates a society of material abundance, right? And that is pretty baked into most varieties of socialism. This notion of that, that the technology itself has to advance to the point where it can produce an abundance that allows for all human needs to be met. So in a way, this is in some sense kind of more interesting and has more even deeper kind of internal tensions in relation to his concerns, because than his kind of disgust for the other middle-class socialists, because in some sense he's, as those passages I was pointing out before, he's kind of disgusted with the way that the society is producing radios and things like that, but not just like meeting people's basic needs, right? But then he also kind of argues that this idea of a high-tech utopia, of sort of a society of fully realized technological advancement that produces sort of infinite abundance, that this, he argues, is actually one of the things that horrifies people, right? So he says, we've reached a stage where the very word socialism calls up a picture of airplanes, tractors, and huge glittering factories of glass and concrete. And he says that, part of what disgusts people is this kind of machine worship, right? So as I said, it's kind of interesting that, as I recall from sort of 10 or 15 years ago, that this idea that, the realization of socialism is sort of concomitant with the full realization of technological advancement, like that seemed to not be something people talked about so much. Then you had, fully automated luxury communism, and you had a few books, published by Verso and so on in the past sort of 5 to 7 years, I guess, that sort of brought this back. And you also had this like accelerationist, I'm trying to remember who the authors of that were, but this accelerationist manifesto that was maybe from like 2013, 2014. So there was an attempt to kind of revive this idea, and this is something you and I have talked about before, but, it kind of goes back to this time when actually the mainstream of sort of sort of centrist opinion was very bullish on technology and sort of the wonders brought about by Silicon Valley, right? And so it was before the kind of souring on the tech industry that you saw, actually both kind of on the left and the right. But then you had these kind of these sort of Verso loft Marxist types kind of reclaiming this idea that no, actually, like the real political, the only way to realize, technologically created abundance is through socialism. And the only way to realize socialism is through technologically created abundance. So, it kind of came back on the scene a bit. I was never really sure how much anybody believed that.
Yeah.
But,
it was a bit inconsistent or half-hearted or something, wasn't it? Because it's like, they sort of do the green thing for 3 years, and then they do the spaceships thing for a year, and then they go back to being greens again.
Right. So, part of the reason why this had kind of died out was basically environmentalism. If you go back to like the old American left, you have, Woody Guthrie writing songs about the wonders of like these dams that are being built under the Works Progress Administration and so on. And, this kind of the sort of wonders of technological progress, right? Whereas then, once you get the 60s, everybody's lamenting how these dams are like killing all the salmon and so on and so forth. So there develops this tension within leftism, which is basically on one hand that you have this set of doctrines, going back to Marx, that really do tie the possibility of socialism or communism directly to the full realization of sort of industrial society, right? And the creation of abundance that will meet all needs. And then on the other hand, you have the kind of environmental awakening of the 60s and 70s, where the sort of romantic concerns that, had existed since the late 18th century or so, with the sort of horrifying destruction wrought by industrialization, become a sort of standard position on the sort of left of center. And then oddly you have, whereas like environmental concerns were in some ways kind of more of a conservative ideology prior to that. Like the great sort of conservationists of 100 years ago in the US were basically kind of Republican WASP types, right? But then the right, interestingly, sort of becomes into like burning all the coal and just and all of that. So there's an interesting sort of flip there. And then what you have with people like the sort of fully automated luxury communism people is this, they have to get into this idea of green technology, right? They have to like
to resolve, to marry the two kind of,
whereas
and also to introduce post-work.
Right, yes, yeah. Whereas in some ways China is sort of, continues to really be the pursuers of this vision, right? And Orwell's sort of critique of this is that, this isn't like that. The idea, we can talk about this in terms of post-work, but like the idea that people actually want a world in which they don't have to work. It like he argues that most people actually find this kind of horrifying. Right?
Yeah. I guess if you think about, like, even in that space of time that you've described, all of the moving over and back from one vision to the other, I think that people correctly intuit that if you are left, if people like this have power to plan society, then you are at the whim of their very changeable plans at all times. So, even something like housing, like that whole machines for living idea, right? And people talk about all the very beautiful housing in Britain that was torn down, and the very big kind of brutalist pieces that were put up, and now people think they're ugly and they're being taken down. And so, like, you're kind of constantly, you can never be left alone. You're kind of constantly being pushed around based on the kind of changing visions of these priestly people, who can change as quickly as the fashions in the Versaloft, like the fashions of ideas in the Versaloft. Like they can go from one of these things to the other, and everyone just has to completely reshape their existence, and nobody knows if it's going to work out or if it's going to be a disaster. But they have to impose the rational vision on society, and they'll probably be dead by the time it's a disaster. So no, they won't have to answer for it.
Yeah, and there's also this there's an aspect of his criticism here that reminds me of Dostoevsky's Notes from Underground, right? Where the sort of opening part of that, which is, kind of this expression of horror. He's talking about the Crystal Palace, right? And the great sort of London exhibition. And there's just kind of this horror of the prospect of a kind of total kind of mechanization and rationalization of the world, right? So I think this is sort of interesting in relation to, on one hand, he's kind of horrified by the way that mechanization and industrialization have sort of produced these bizarre kind of irrationalities in the first part, but then there's almost a kind of apposite horror and it's, here I think he's also trying to hypothesize why this kind of futurism actually doesn't appeal to people, right? And that, that there is something actually, there is another kind of horror that this kind of vision incites. And, I think another point is he kind of talks about, that there are all of these things that, it's interesting. There were people kind of writing about this like 10 years ago in relation to the tech, like this journalist named Nicholas Carr, who wrote a couple kind of early books that were critical of big tech and the sort of supposed improvements it was bringing about, right? And, just this idea that getting machines to do everything for you does not, or it entails certain losses, right? That there are certain values to be found in, skilled handiwork and things like that, are simply, and this, I suppose goes back in some ways to the kind of romantic anti-industrialism that you brought up before of, going back to sort of the Luddites and so on. But that there's not only a kind of economic deprivation linked to that, but there's a kind of, a loss of a sort of fundamental humanity that is manifest in those sorts of activities.
Yeah, I mean, I guess it's sort of like a contemporary example that comes to mind is the rage, the rage that people feel when they're forced to use self checkouts. You know,
Yeah.
and so and you complexify these things. Like the whole point originally of this new, like say shopping centers and things like that, was supposed to make the whole experience less complicated, so that you did not have to go and find each individual thing. But and now it's sort of just complicated things to a point where you're just like end up like abandoning your bags and leaving in frustration, like I would not do that, but like my parents would probably do that, and they constantly complain about having to do this and using automated things that end up requiring more labor ultimately and things like that. um the only good piece of art, I'm thinking of like TV, like movies, like novels, anything that has been made about the COVID period, is South Park. Did you see the COVID South Park?
No, I haven't.
It's really, really good. I think it's two parts. They're long. They're like longer than an average episode. And it's actually really, really good and really clever. There's like one guy that refuses to be vaccinated, and they're decades in, to the lockdown. And they're in this dystopia of the future. And what's really interesting about it is basically all the technology is sort of like that. It's everything is incredibly annoying to use, and everything is just the same brands but with a plus or something after it, or a super, like something indicating that it's a better version. But like everyone goes through life dealing with this like constant frustration of being presented with things that are supposed to be helpful but are just really confusing and end up taking longer than doing it yourself. And they're all sort of, everyone in it is really depressed, and they're sort of accepting that like, oh, it's the future now, so this is just the way it's going to be forever. And at one point, like, they have to lock down South Park, and there's the military is there, and they're shooting they're shooting people who are trying to run to like a football game or something like that, who are trying to exit South Park. And like, yeah, it was actually so like, for example, what do you call the thing, the voice, Siri or something like that? I
Yeah,
can't remember if
yeah.
it's Siri or if it's something else, but it's one of
Alexa.
the
Yeah.
Alexa. Yeah, Alexa, that's it. So one of the guys, I think it might be Kyle, has the Alexa. She appears as a real woman, like beside him in the car, and then but she starts sort of nagging him and stuff. And yeah, and so he has this incredibly frustrating relationship with the Alexa, and it just goes on like that. And it's like, it's actually really like one of the cleverest satires of the way that technology, the like absurd, kind of like irrational way that technology is going, where there's basically no innovation occurring. It just has the feeling of newness, and the constant boasting of progress, within it. But yeah, like, it's just a dystopian for people to live in.
Right. And I mean, this, relates to a couple of things. One is, it's been interesting for me to see, like, I've actually, one person I've kept tabs on is, the author of the aforementioned Fully Automated Luxury Communism. And of course, it turns out he's a sort of hardcore lockdown proponent, right? And I mean, there's some way in which, like, all of this kind of that, and then the sort of Green New Deal concept, it's like the real project that all of the people who are invested in those things have been invested in is continuing lockdowns and
Mm.
other kinds of restrictions. So, and there are certain continuities, right? Because, on one hand, it is this kind of, well, it's essentially this kind of faux post-work society of abundance, right? Where,
Mm.
I don't know, you just sit at your computer at home all day and have food delivered to you by Instasurfs. And then, you're also kind of, you're advocating for the economy to be propped up. There's all this sort of modern monetary theory stuff. So you're advocating basically what you want is for, nobody to have to go to work ever again, and for just, the Fed to keep printing money
Mm.
So it's a weird kind of virtual it's the weird sort of virtual abundance of monetary policy,
Mm.
which, you know, has, I mean, and I had that episode recently with Fabio Vighi about this, but, you know, it's become the kind of ersatz project of all the people who were previously advocating these more kind of pie in the sky schemes. And so, you know, it's an interesting sort of bait and switch or something like that. But it's almost like a travesty or parody of all these highfalutin ideals that, you know, have been promoted previously.
Yeah, I mean, and even something like automation, you know, I still see reports in the news regularly where they say, oh, Germany says they need like 1 million more workers or something like that. And it's like, but wait, I thought I thought that everyone was going to be fired because of automation. Like um yeah, and the thing is, like, the real economy goes on, you know, like if the real economy doesn't keep turning, like we all freeze and die of starvation. You know, if the truckers don't deliver the food, we don't eat food. And so yeah, those people basically, they simply can't. I like using the phrase the real economy because I think that no matter what, whether you consider yourself like more right leaning or left leaning or whatever, the simple fact of that is something that you have to just keep coming back to, because those post-work people, I mean, it's sort of an obvious thing to say, but it's basically what's going on. They want themselves to be free of it, but they know perfectly well that I assume they know perfectly well that you know, the wheels have to keep turning all the time, and that's the only way that their life is possible.
So I have another passage that kind of relates to some of these issues that comes towards the end of the book, which relates to all of this stuff about sort of automation and mechanization. So he says, you know, it amounts to saying, so he's talking about this idea that we just kind of have to accept industrial progress and so on. So it amounts to saying we're soft, for God's sake, let us stay soft, which at least is realistic. As I've pointed out already, the machine has got us in its grip, and to escape will be immensely difficult. Nevertheless, this answer is really an evasion because it fails to make clear what we mean when we say we want this or that. I am a degenerate modern semi-intellectual who would die if I did not get my early morning cup of tea and my New Statesman every Friday. Clearly, I do not, in a sense, want to return to a simpler, harder, probably agricultural way of life. In the same sense, I don't want to cut down my drinking, pay my debts, take enough exercise to be faithful to my wife, etc., etc. But in another and more permanent sense, I do want these things. And perhaps in the same sense, I want a civilization in which progress is not definable as making the world safe for little fat men. These that I've outlined are practically the only arguments that I've been able to get from socialists, thinking book training socialists, when I've tried to explain to them just how they are driving away possible adherents. Of course, there's also the old argument that socialism is going to arrive anyway, whether people like it or not, because of that trouble-saving thing, historic necessity. So anyway, I think, I mean, he's again expressing a kind of ambivalence here because he does seem to accept technological change and advancement as a sort of fait accompli that you can't really dial back. But at the same time, he essentially, his critique here is that if you don't acknowledge that there are fundamental and real losses that are entailed by that, then you're simply not acknowledging, you know, how and why people might respond to it the way that they do.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I guess like that he has always like that sort of, yeah, the common sense kind of, I mean, like that's like the most hated thing, right? By by leftists, if you say common sense, in many ways, like their ultimate war is against the concept of common sense, because it's always that, no, we have to show that everything that seems like common sense is socially constructed and therefore malleable and therefore and also potentially wrong, so it can be gotten rid of, as if something being a social construct means that it's wrong anyway, you know. But that is like probably like the central theme of the whole thing in a way. And yeah, he sticks with, he does, in all of his writing, there is this sense that there is value in common sense. And that's definitely one of the reasons why he continues to be disliked, by them.
Yeah, and this, relates to his. I mean, he does say that at least the way that he thinks about socialism, he regards it as common sense,
Mm.
right?
Yeah, yeah.
So then, I mean, it's also worth noting I mean, he has his own, in a sense, he kind of has his advice for how socialism should be um, promoted or propagandized, right?
Mm.
And one of the main ways one of the main arguments that he makes is that it should stand for opposition to tyranny, right?
Mm-hmm.
And that should stand for basically freedom and opposition to tyranny.
Mm.
But I think this kind of goes back to perhaps maybe the way in which the person who said he didn't define it was correct, is that I don't feel he develops that argument fully.
Mm.
But it does relate to something I wrote about recently, which was this new David Graeber book, or posthumous David Graeber book about
Mm.
a sort of human prehistory.
Mm.
Have you come across
No,
this?
I haven't.
I
I've
mean,
seen people talking about it, but I haven't read it.
yeah, it's extremely it's definitely worth a read, although it's quite long. But to me, the most stunning sort of irony of it is that, I mean, of course, he's a self-described anarchist, but but it was extremely well received by all the sort of socialist publications and so on. But he, in a way, sort of defines his politics similarly, right? That the most important sort of political value is the right to disobey, right? Is the right to freedom in the sense of not having someone else, whether it's a boss or a state official or whatever, tell you what to do, right?
Mm.
Without without your consent. Yeah, and I mean, the thing I found most astonishing about this argument, and it's being well received, was that basically all the publications that, I mean, this kind of goes back to the COVID point, but all the publications that gave him these sort of glowing reviews are, of course, in lockstep with all of these mandates, right?
Mm.
And then what's even stranger is that somebody, when I was posting about this, or maybe after I wrote the review of the book, somebody shared with me an interview that, because he died in, I think, like August of 2020.
Mm.
So shortly before his death, he gave this interview in which he basically said that, when you have like doctors and public health officials tell you what to do, it's not really arbitrary authority, because what they're saying is based on scientific evidence. And
Mm.
so if you reject that, then you're simply, irrationally rejecting the facts or something along those lines.
Mm.
So, so essentially he's creating this kind of bizarre loophole by which, after writing this book that's sort of, the fundamental argument of which is that, the sort of bedrock political value is the right to disobey.
Mm.
And then, basically saying, well, but it's different if it's public health authorities, telling you what to do and making you
Mm.
stay at home, and, making you get certain injections and things like that. And so I think this again goes to this kind of notion of a kind of priestly managerial elite, right?
Mm.
Which, is, and, whether in the form of socialism or not, is and has been kind of inserting itself into power structures in a way that allows it to exercise authority in certain ways that can still allow it kind of plausible deniability by which it can pretend to not be
Mm.
simply a sort of another arbitrary power structure, right? And
Oh
so
yeah, I mean I've seen lots of anarchists and things like that who our 4 lockdowns, and our 4 like a really, really heavy like state like force being used, And so, okay, what does that mean? Like, how can we interpret that? I mean, is it just a case of, like Malcolm would say, the purpose of leftism is to feather the nests of leftists? It's just one of his funny lines. Is it just that? I mean, is it just that they empower themselves because that's what people do?
Yeah, I mean, and I guess the only things I would add is that you have these kind of two, so I think of it in terms of a kind of evolution of power, and I guess here I'm thinking in a more kind of Foucauldian way, maybe, right? That sort of I think what and the other thing I've written about recently is this kind of odd fusion of technocracy with kind of moralizing, which again ties back to this sort of priestly status, right, of this class. That it's on one hand kind of claiming to be, purely enforcing the dictates of, the science, capital S, but then on the other hand, its means of doing that often takes the form of this kind of fanatical moral exhortation, right? And so, both of these are ways of kind of denying that they are exercising power in a sense, because, in the first case, as Graeber basically argued, it's like, well, it's not really power. You're just kind of telling people what the facts are. And then if they don't want to get in line with that, well, they're just irrational. So that's not an expression of any right or freedom, right? It's just pure, orneriness or something. And then on the other hand, it's like, well, we're not tyrannical authorities. We're just saying that you don't have the right to literally murder people, right? By going outside or not wearing a mask or whatever, right? So it's this kind of it's this two-pronged sort of self-justification of this type of authority, right? Where on one hand it's like it's merely enforcing the known scientific facts, and on the other hand it's positioning itself as the defender of life itself, right? And so that is a very kind of it's very in line, I argue, with sort of how various theorists like Foucault sort of saw power evolving. But I guess the other thing that's interesting here is that it does tie it back to this notion of a kind of priestly caste, right? That I think we're already getting a sense of out of Orwell, and that I mean, it's interesting, right? He with the sort of post-war era, this would have to be another episode probably, but he does kind of have a critique of the managerial state, at the same time that, like, James Burnham is developing his, right, in 1984, right, where it's not really just that he imagines sort of Soviet communism to take over the world. It's that he sees this kind of managerial mode of government becoming the default one, and kind of emerging in different ways in different polities, but nevertheless kind of essentially establishing itself almost inexorably across the world.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting to see this kind of clash going on with truckers. It's actually happening all over the world. There was one in Ireland as well. A bunch of truckers sort of broke. I believe they actually broke. They were unionized, but they broke away from the main union, and they sort of, I think they just basically had a Facebook page, and they just decided that they were going to block this main port into Dublin and just park the trucks. And they were saying that basically fuel costs have been going up and up and up and up. And it's become almost impossible to live on the amount of money that you actually end up with when you have paid for all the various vehicle things that can go wrong and the fuel costs. But again, like, how are fully automated luxury eco-communism, how are they going to get their utopia if people do not pay the fuel tax, you know? And so, but what was so funny was that when I looked at the reports, like people always talk about the left-wing media and things like that, right? When I looked at the newspaper reports, and these guys were not doing the vaccine thing, right? So they didn't even have that excuse. There was nothing else. It was just about the fuel. And when I looked at the papers, the same papers that will just regurgitate kind of NGO speak and all the stuff that is coming from the left, you know, in that sense, they were totally hostile to them, no sympathy whatsoever. And these guys were saying, look, we can't even make money. Like, this is so bad that it's not even profitable to do this. And their attitude, the newspapers just went and interviewed a load of annoyed people. They interviewed shopkeepers who were annoyed, politicians who were annoyed, you know, various NGO people who were annoyed, eco people who were annoyed. And they didn't even interview, in many cases, in any of the cases that I read, the truckers themselves. And when I went looking for some kind of quotes or some kind of where I could find like their perspective, that's what they said. They said the fuel tax is now so bad that we can barely make money doing this. And so those people who, you know, are being quoted in this article and who are writing this article, as I said, you know, would starve and freeze to death without these truckers. And they are so unaware or so unconcerned with this fact of the real economy that their attitude is like, oh well, you can, you know, the entire trucking industry is about to collapse, big deal, you know. I don't want to be inconvenienced for one day, for a few hours. I will be enraged and I will go to my journalist friend and tell them how enraged I am. And so that's kind of that is their like way of seeing the world, where they just like are above the real economy. And so to them, they can swing wildly from like romanticism to technological utopia, but as long as it involves the real economy being absent or unseen, they don't want to see it, they don't want to know it's there, they don't want to have to deal with the people who run it, you know, in any way. And that is basically usually the vision, you know.
Right. And, you know, this is why when you see these kind of demands that, you know, basically the whole economy locked down until there's zero COVID, I
Mm.
mean, it really is premised on this denial of what, you know,
Mm.
lockdowns actually looked like,
Mm.
and of the idea, you know, of just the fact that you know, there are these other systems that have to work in order for you to like get your food every day and things like that.
Yeah, I'm
Um,
sure I've mentioned it a couple of times to you because I'm always telling people to read it. Richard Barbrook's book, Imaginary Futures. Did I ever talk to you about that?
not sure. I can't remember.
It's really excellent. It's one of the books that has had the most impact on me that I can think of. I mean, it would definitely be in like a top 5 or something. And interestingly, he starts with that, you know, the Crystal Palace thing. Well, he kind of looks at this whole history of what became the World's Fair, same concept basically. And he's kind of saying that there's this, it's like a repetition of the same theme of an imaginary future, and always the image of the future is a workerless world, a one world with no workers. So the global village was what Daniel Bell, who talked about the post-industrial society, he and others took on the McLuhan idea of the global village as a way, but Barbara is basically saying this is just repeating the same formula over and over again. You know, it's really interesting. But
Yeah.
another point, just while I think of it, one thing I always wonder is what is the pistachio shirt about? What, because clearly it has some significance to people who were around at the time that they would have known what he was referring to. Do you have
Yeah,
any idea?
I don't. We should ask like an older. We should. Let's see. I know a few like older British people, so maybe I'll ask
Yeah.
them and see if I can
Yeah,
find
if anyone
out.
listening knows,
Yeah, yeah,
tell us. Because
yeah.
I was
Let us
thinking,
know.
does he mean khaki kind of? Because that would make a certain amount of sense, you know.
Right,
If it
right.
was like our army, surplus kind of, if they were trying to look like,
Yeah,
that would make sense. But I don't know. Pistachio
yeah,
shirts.
yeah. We should look into that.
Yeah.
Um, so why don't we wrap up? But first, I just wanted to ask you for listeners who maybe haven't been following your Substack. You've been kind of going in some interesting directions there that might not have been things people anticipated from your earlier work.
Hmm.
So, would you just briefly talk about some of the stuff you've been writing about recently?
Yeah, well, it is a little bit all over the place because it's Substack, I kind of get to write about whatever I feel like. So the last thing I wrote was actually a very practical co-authored thing, which was about actually like building the real economy in Ireland because we're kind of a car
You're a
park of yeah.
Silicon Valley colony.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, yeah. And so, as always happens when you have this kind of like free trade relationship, the kind of native economy died basically. Like it's something like 95% of the exporting economy is foreign owned, is multinationals. And so, now there's this problem of like, what if this model dies? What if this falls apart? We're actually really screwed. I mean, we have some infrastructure of a modern economy, like obviously roads and water and all things like that. But in terms of the productive economy, we basically have none. I mean, almost none. And so that's a really dangerous position to be in. So me and this guy, Peter Ryan, have been trying to deal with that. And we're trying to be practical minded about it and come up with sort of practical ideas, how we could possibly start to think about what to do in the situation that happens. The old model falls apart. Well, it will fall apart, but it's just a case of like, we don't know whether it's going to be a crash or something slower. And then I've also written things that are just completely nothing to do with that and completely unlike that. I wrote a piece recently called Unremarkable Clothes. And I was trying to figure out why it is that in a time of abundance and particularly a global fashion industry that's bigger than it's ever been, why we all dress in this sort of like gray sweatpants sort of way, like we actually look really similar to each other. There's actually very little individual expression. So it's not a question of, most of us think that this time is characterized by individualism. And so basically, I think people are dressing as if they have a VR headset on, like people are dressing as if nobody can perceive them in a way. And then some other things I kind of suggested, but I'm not sure if they're true. I just sort of posed them as questions like, is this an expression of some kind of humility, like we're trying to express humility, or is it something else? But it is interesting that for all of our supposed individualism, like that's not coming out. If you just like were an alien and looked at society right now, you would never. It looks like 1984, actually, the movie adaptation, right? Everyone is just dressed in gray cotton basically most of the time. If you take like a random street like view, then I'm also looking at this kind of this other tradition, right? This counter tradition in economics, which is the national economy system that is most closely associated with Friedrich List. And how I sort of became interested in this was my co-author of those pieces, Peter Ryan, did a master's thesis. It was actually on kind of how successful revolutionaries dealt with the question of finance. And then within that thesis, there's this interesting bit that one of the Irish revolutionaries, one of the really brilliant minds of it, Arthur Griffith, was very influenced by Friedrich List. And he was kind of like evangelizing, like everyone in Ireland must read Friedrich List. So then I started reading about that. And then I discovered like, wow, literally every successful like world leading economy followed the Listian model. America did it, Japan did it, Germany did it. And interestingly, most interestingly of all, Britain did it, but then they pretended that they didn't do it. And they preached to the world the opposite doctrine, you know. So, you know, they preached the idea of like free trade, basically. But in fact, they had done what every successful. So I was thinking, how can I not have known this? How can have gotten to this age being so interested in these subjects and never have encountered this stuff? And what you also find is that, I mean, I'm going to write more about it, so maybe we can even go into it in detail at some point in the future. But not only is it the only successful method, but the man who really like gave the world the kind of published the secret sauce, basically, of imperial success before they became empires. You know, and of course, the British Empire banned the colonies from industrializing for this very reason, because they knew that it was the only way. And so that also kind of ties into what we were talking about earlier about the real economy. You know, there's this kind of endless conspiracy to hide the real economy, you know, to wish that it wasn't there, to hide what it's doing, to downplay its significance, you know. And then you learn that actually, well, that's actually what the empires did. They taught the colonies, oh, this doesn't matter, you don't need this, you know, you can just have, like in that book that you mentioned, the Turner book, whatever it is, from counterculture to cyberculture, that's a theme in that book too, where he talks about how like appropriate technologies, how these kind of savior tech people taught the underdeveloped economies of the world that, oh, you can just leapfrog that whole part of history and you can just have appropriate technologies instead. So yeah, that actually does kind of tie in a way, but it's a very interesting counter history. And what you really, it just opens up a totally different way of seeing history, because then you kind of also realize that the Bolsheviks just did exactly the same thing as well. You know, they called it Marxism, but they did exactly the same thing. They understood that the Listian way is the only way. There's no other way to go from poverty to development. And yet, like, even the most people who are obsessively political, who read everything, who are really interested in these questions, can go their whole lives without even knowing the name Friedrich List. I think that's just amazing. So that's kind of my obsession at the moment. So if you if you subscribe to my Substack, you're going to learn a lot of stuff about Friedrich List and related things, and also random things like clothes.
Yeah, and I mean, interestingly, he was also, you know, sort of explicitly criticized by Marx and Engels, right? Who were, as I recall from reading you on this, you know, who were actually themselves much more advocates of the free trade position, right?
Yeah, well, I mean, this is the classic chessboard thing that Orwell was talking about. Marx was kind of, they thought, well, no, if this Friedrich List character gets his way, then people will just develop and be wealthy and happy without us, you know, and they won't need us. So if you have just the total baptism of fire of like free trade, just ripping through the world, and you don't have this kind of German school, which of course Marx knew very well, right? Because that was what he was swimming in. But no, he sort of he said free trade is better because it will produce the revolution we want. Because that's what the chessboard like way of viewing the world is, you know.
Right. And I mean, a few things. It seems like there is an interesting continuity with your previous piece from a couple years ago on open borders, right? Where you kind of linked the ideological attachment to open borders with the sort of free trade doctrines of the U.S., you know, sort of informal empire post Cold War.
Yeah.
And, you know, that, I mean, and then a few other points, you know, it's interesting thinking of this from Ireland, which, you know, essentially goes from being, you know, one form, you know, from sort of feudalism to to sort of Silicon Valley neo-feudalism, right?
Yeah.
Without the intermediary stage. And
Yeah, and so
so, of
that's
course,
why they saw it as their perfect like guinea pig kind of, or, you know what I
and
mean, or their perfect model, because they said, look, this is successful, you don't need to do any of this other stuff, you can just leapfrog this, and so we can now do this in the third world.
right, and so of course that means Ireland goes from being ruled by the Catholic priesthood to being ruled by the sort of, you know, the tech industry, neo-feudal
Yeah.
sort of
Oh my God.
PMC priesthood.
It's so bad. The PMC priesthood thing is so bad here. It's shocking. I mean, I think it's always a really good experiment to change your habits of finding information, and just to see like what would it be like if I just watch TV, or if I just listen to radio or something like that. And so I was sitting here with my dad watching TV, and some news talk show came on, and it was like they were talking, it was all these women, and they were like, you need to be better allies. We have to, it's not enough just to be anti-racist, you have to be an active ally. And like they were just repeating this on Irish television, and I was imagining all these grannies and granddads watching this being like, what on earth are they talking about? And I said to my dad, do you know what they were just talking about? Does this make any sense to you? And he just said, oh, well, at my age I just tuned them out.
Yeah, that's incredible. But all too revealing of our the current state of the world. So,
Yeah.
in any case, let's leave it there. People should check out your Substack, obviously, and perhaps we can talk again about Friedrich List or 1984 or some combination of those.
Yeah. Okay, thanks.
So, thanks for coming on again.
Yeah, it's great to be on.